Okay. Oh, it's on. Hi. Hi, everyone. All right. Sorry about that. Technology. I really did think by putting this all in the cloud, it was going to make things much easier. And the reason I went through all this trouble for you to know who we are is so that you know how to reach us. And during this presentation, if you have any questions, I have my Twitter feed live here, and I will try to take your questions if you want to shoot them out and you're shy about it and you don't want to stand up to the mic. I, of course, have a lot of questions myself for these amazing people that I've asked once again to join me on stage, and I'm so glad that they have. We were asked to do this Kubernetes panel for the CNCF track in Boston, at the summit in Boston. Who was in the summit in Boston? Okay, did anyone see the Kubernetes track and see our panel on this in Boston? Oh, awesome, we can just do the exact same thing. And no way, the world has changed a lot.
All new to you.
The world has changed a lot in a year. So we have updated this, but I love talking about Kubernetes, and I really especially love talking about Kubernetes in the real world and Kubernetes in production. And all of these amazing people on stage have different approaches to this and different stories. So these are my brothers. I love them. I will let them introduce themselves. Gu, will you tell the audience who you are?
Sure. My name is Gu Rao. I'm the CTO at Portworx. At Portworx, we focus on cloud-native storage. So we enable people to run stateful applications on any cloud via container orchestrator like Kubernetes. So people that are embracing DevOps to manage their application infrastructure deployment with Kubernetes, that's kind of our intersection where we help them managing their stateful application deployments.
Go ahead, Tony.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tony. Last name is Campbell, just like the soup, but I don't own any stock, unfortunately. I currently work for Red Hat as a head of field engineering. Basically what that means is I lead up a team that goes out into the field and helps people work on Kubernetes in particular. I'm new to Red Hat. I'm not wearing a shirt underneath it, but I was with CoreOS, so we're newly acquired by Red Hat. But I was with CoreOS and did the same sort of work with CoreOS. If you all are familiar with CoreOS, that is a company behind several things in the Kubernetes ecosystem, including etcd, Quay, Tectonic, things like that, Rocket. Operators, yes. And so my current life is all about operators now. So if there's questions about operators out there, I'd love to take those questions. And then before CoreOS, I was with Rackspace for 14 years and still live in San Antonio, Texas, home of Rackspace.
I'm Robert Starmer, founder of Cumulus Technologies, not Cumulus Networks. We have a K in our name. We focus on helping enterprises get the most out of cloud deployments. So we did a lot of work in the early Openstack days and helping people deploy and integrate Openstack into their development environments. And obviously now we're moving towards doing the same thing with Kubernetes and containerized workloads. A lot of that is helping people understand how to shift their culture to support new technologies and integrate them into the end-to-end development and release pipeline.
And when we were doing a presentation at Container World this year, when I asked Tony to be on stage with me, he was still with CoreOS, and so which I thought was super cool to be on stage with someone from CoreOS. But he wouldn't.
Still cool.
It's super cool. He wouldn't let me put. There's been a rebranding. He wouldn't let me put CoreOS on the slide. Anyway, so I want to start maybe with a question for Robert, because Robert's also a certified COA, certified OpenStack admin, and he's going into a lot of customers and helping implement all these solutions. So I want to ask, and you can all answer, but Robert especially, how do enterprises are looking to transform their architectures now into container services, and so, but of course they still want all the reliability and all of the security and all the things that they've been traditionally used to. So how are they making that shift, and what are they bumping up against, and how do you help them?
I think the biggest thing is still this ability to shift your culture. Many people are saying, well, containers are the new thing, so I have to implement containers. So let me take what I'm doing with my normal operations processes and just take the things that I was turning into VMs and make them containers, and there, I'm done. Now I have all these wonderful tools. Kubernetes seems so lightweight and so fabulous, and so I'm just going to run all my applications like that. And they miss the fact that there's actually a big step between a scalable functional container environment environment and an underlying VM management environment. I mean, even just from the operations perspective. So really understanding what those shifts really look like is sort of one of the first things that any enterprise really has to digest and understand what that means in terms of their development process, what their developers are doing, what their operators need to do. I don't know how many times I've heard somebody say, you know, I'd love to use these containers, but I can't SSH into them. Exactly. If you're thinking about SSH into them, you're thinking wrong, and it's just a shift. You have to understand, how do I change that thinking so that I can now start using these new technologies in a more effective fashion, right?
If I might add to that too, one of the things that I heard earlier today is that a lot of people need to implement pain-driven development. So what pain-driven development is you don't adopt a technology until you're feeling the pain that technology will solve, right? But a lot of people go and adopt the technology because it's hot, everybody's talking about it, everybody has a t-shirt that says Kubernetes on it, so I'm gonna deploy Kubernetes, right? But we really need to use some pain-driven development. Like if there's not specific use cases that you need Kubernetes or containers to solve, it's okay. It's okay that you're not running it. Use it when you need it, or if you're experimenting in it, but definitely don't push it into production or just jump into that solution just because everybody else is doing it.
So I want to talk about some of those use cases, and I just realized I didn't even introduce myself, and the slide only sort of reflects, particularly my role at this conference. I'm Lisa Marie Amphy, as also Software Dev Angel on IRC and on Twitter, and I'm the OpenStack ambassador for North America. There's actually 4 of us now. I was the only one for a while, so we have a Canadian ambassador. So you probably all know Stacy. He's your wonderful ambassador for OpenStack, based out of Montreal, and I'm based out of California, and I run the San Francisco Bay Area user community and have done for about the last 5 years. So it's one of the world's largest. I think it is. I don't know. They say there's some big ones in China, but I haven't seen the numbers. So we'll still say that we're the largest. We're over 6,500 members, and it's a really active community. So for those of you who are in the Bay Area, come to our meetups, and for those of you that aren't, we do tend to live stream, Google Hangout, or for sure record and put everything up on a YouTube channel. So lots of OpenStack and cloud native, open infra information that's available to you. And this is one of my favorite topics, and I've done 18 meetups on Kubernetes in the last 2 years. So, so there's a lot of content out there if we don't get to everything today. But I want to ask you, so I also joined Portworx about 3 months ago. Still really new, so I want to ask you some questions, you know, so I can learn about Portworx. But actually, just more generically, I hear a lot of people saying containers are for stateless. You know, it's not for stateful. But then you just go, well, what about the data? What are you going to do with it? I mean, like, we just can't. It doesn't go away.
I want to run Postgres.
Yeah, and then the last time I was on stage with one of our customers, he just goes, the only stateless application that exists is Hello World. I was like, yeah, that was our customer Neo, who's running Kubernetes in production. But anyway, so you built a whole company. Gu is the founder and CTO of Portworx, and you built a company to solve this problem because it turns out people do want to put stateful applications in containers. Wow. So, you know, why did you get that crazy idea to do this? And tell us about this.
Yeah, I just want to echo what they said here earlier, which is if something's working for you and you have a VM-centric approach to managing your application infrastructure, you should continue to do that. Don't just embrace change because everybody else is saying that. The reason containers make sense from my perspective are for cloud-native applications where it's less about whether it's stateless or stateful, and that's not the argument. It's a new pattern that you want to embrace as a company. I would say that, and really is top-down, leadership-driven down. So from the CIO, CTO level down, if you as a company are focused on business agility, which is what? Being able to make changes faster, empowering your developers, not having a separate IT department that has to do infrastructure provisioning. It's about that programmatic provisioning of infrastructure and deployment of applications. And I think that's where containers start making sense, because a couple of things here start resonating, right? Number one, you realize that applications today, especially cloud-native applications, they're not monolithic, right? So it's not like I write a piece of program that can all be packaged in a single VM and be deployed using traditional VM-centric deployment tools. You look at a modern application; it's service. It comprises of multiple services, like take Cassandra. It's multiple containers. It's not just one container. They're deployed on multiple machines. So now you realize that containers start making better sense for packaging my applications, not a VM. Secondly, you realize that I need a container native, cloud native orchestrator like Kubernetes so that I can deploy these applications in a cloud native environment. And so, Lisa, the question you asked is like what we focused on is realizing that most of these applications rely on state because they're not ephemeral. You can have an ephemeral applications. You can subscribe to the 12-factor notion of how to build applications, but generally, most, especially enterprise applications, they rely on state. And so we wanted to complement Kubernetes by providing that stateful data layer or stateful data plane, because Kubernetes is your control plane in this new world, and allow you to deploy any stateful applications with just as much ease on any machine, any cloud.
Okay, that's awesome. So when we get around to actually doing this, so is it just I'm going to go back to Robert on this question. Is it just enterprises that are going to do this because of the ops resources? I mean, whose job is this actually to get this stuff up and running and secure it and make sure it stays working? How do they do this?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that, small companies, startups today are saying, I'm not going to do this myself. I'm going to go to a provider and start with a provider, right? But the larger enterprises, especially the companies that already have lots of infrastructure in place, they have VM-based deployment and development paradigms, and they're looking at those next layer of services, or they're trying to take an application and make it more agile, address feature velocity and a lot of these sorts of business drivers into their application. They're saying, how can we get there? Because the current models tend to be slower than what you can get if you can get to an agile development process, and especially can start breaking things up into microservices when you've gotten to that level of scale. So these are the companies that are big enough to potentially run their own environment, or still maybe they may still decide to go out into the public cloud in general. But they're doing this in a way so that they can change how they're developing their applications, and are taking that culture shift to actually do that. So that's sort of their first step, is say, yes, we know we want to do this. We can see why, because there's business value, right? There's a need for me to change how we're developing. And while I could potentially continue to do this in virtual machines, containers will give my developers and even potentially my ops pipeline a much more efficient process for getting my resources deployed. And that's really a lot of what's driving, I think, this entire space, the containerization space.
But so to be clear, and Tony, you can take this, do you have to go to an Amazon or an Azure or a Google? And how else would you do this?
Nice setup question there, Lisa. No, you do not have to go to a cloud provider like Amazon or Azure to do this. You can do it yourself. In fact, one of the things we find in open source communities is there's a lot of people who are DIY, right? I'm doing it myself just because I can, right? It's that badge of pride, right? I can do it myself. So there's a lot of people out there doing it themselves. You can definitely do it yourself, but you don't have to. There are providers out there that can do this stuff for you, that can help you with this, so you can focus on your core competencies. One thing I think is interesting too, though, the enterprises are adopting Kubernetes a lot, but that's also opening up an opportunity for independent software developers. So if you have your own software package that you want to sell into the enterprise, if you can create that software so that it runs effectively on a Kubernetes platform, with the adoption of Kubernetes in the enterprise, you're able to take your software and actually reach a whole marketplace of folks just by putting it on Kubernetes and making your application run well in Kubernetes. So any entrepreneurs out there, it's a good place to start.
Well, especially from an operations perspective, right? I mean, you change the operational model because the operations is now encompassed in the control plane, the control operators within the Kubernetes environment, right?
Robert's going to make me go there. Yes, absolutely. So one of the things we talked about is the whole concept of operators. Has anybody heard of Kubernetes operators? Couple. Okay. Thank you. So we just announced an open source project a couple weeks ago. It's called the Operator Framework. You can find it at github.com/operator-framework. High level. Here's what it does. Your operators, your system administrators, they know how to run an application, right? They know how to run something like Kafka and all the details around how to run a Kafka server. We're taking that information and we're putting it into code and being able to run that code in Kubernetes. We use the Kubernetes API, we use the Kubernetes primitives, Kubernetes custom resources, and you encapsulate all that knowledge. Here's how I back up a Kafka server. Here's how I upgrade a Kafka server. It's all in code, so as Kubernetes is watching pods, and Kubernetes is watching config maps, it's also watching this new CRD, custom resource definition, called a Kafka server, and it's able to take action on that Kafka server. Okay, you can go, ooh, that is hot. right? So you're able to use Kubernetes to do the operation tasks that you usually need to do manually. You can use the Kubernetes API and Kubernetes primitives to do this.
Yeah, well, one thing that I'd add to Lisa's earlier question is around AWS or Google. I think the new solution elements that we're finding that customers want to focus on is owning that software infrastructure stack such that it can run on any cloud provider, right? You don't want to be locked into an AWS or a Google. And I think if you look at Kubernetes, what does it provide you? It provides you that cloud agnostic compute experience where your developers can go in and say, maybe this ties in with what Tony was talking about with operators, but somebody could generically say, here's my Kafka cluster, and they would just describe it programmatically via code, and things just run. And I'm a developer. I don't want to know that it's going to run on AWS and the intricacies involved with AWS, EC2 instances, EBS volumes, or Google. That's irrelevant for me. I just want my application to run. And so this whole, there's a new set of patterns that are emerging, right, with Kubernetes and operators, and that's what we're trying to facilitate here. So you can run anywhere, any complex application, most importantly, at the developer's controls. There's no IT involved.
And I think if you dive into all of those infrastructure layers, we've abstracted compute, and it's very obvious, I think, because that's what Kubernetes really focuses on. But I think one of the nice things is that we've also abstracted the network and the storage layers, right? And so, like the Portworx tools enable that storage layer to be resilient, scalable, distributed on top of everything. And the network side as well, we have all these plugins that can plug in underneath the covers to provide resiliency, to provide ingress for load balancing services if you don't want to use a third party's baked-in load balancing solution, right? We have a number of tools to really simplify that process and make it possible to forklift my application into any number of different clouds.
So you guys talked about VMs a little bit in the beginning, and VMs are not going away. VMware is not going away, despite what some people at this conference have tried to say already on main stage at the keynote. But it's actually a real question, because I'm seeing people trying to put everything in containers. And so at what point, including VMs, so at what point do you decide, what stays in a VM? Where am I going to get more benefit out of putting something in a container? What's the upside, and when do you make that jump?
It's a great topic to talk about because people confuse VMs versus containers, and it's not that. Virtual machines provide an awesome way to manage your hardware infrastructure. And that's for your traditional IT staff to decide how they want to manage their physical environment. To be honest, a lot of container deployments are in cloud, and guess what? They're running in VMs. So VMs versus containers is completely not a topic at all. Containers provide a way for how you want to manage your application infrastructure. VMs provide a way for how you want to manage your physical infrastructure. Those are not the same thing. And I don't know why people confuse them. Very, very, very few people are hyper-focused on performance and will choose to run containers bare metal. The audience that containers and Kubernetes is catering to is more facilitating developer agility. If that happens to run in a VM, so what?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good way of distinction between the two domains. Long-running processes, applications that were built to be maintained and to run within a single state, one process running for as many hours or as many days or weeks or even years as possible. VMs are a nicer way of managing the infrastructure that can support those processes. Containers, on the other hand, are great for application developers, especially in agile, rapid turnaround lifecycle development, where I want to fix something anytime I make a change. If I can make a change every day, I want to fix something every day. Well, VMs tend to be heavier. It's not that you couldn't use those, and in the past, pre-container, which is like 2 years ago, that's what we were doing. We said, okay, I've got a patch, I roll out a new VM, maybe I deploy a new one, I run my Ansible or Puppet or Chef or Salt or whatever else it is that I wrote to get my app deployed, now my app is running again. That's fantastic. With containers, because I've sort of pre-bundled it, I'm running this through more automated processes, more automated tests. We just talked about storage in another panel here shortly ago. I can now actually start incorporating, not storage, security into, I can start incorporating security into my development process because I can iterate on that much more rapidly as well. it's a shift of mindset. It's a shift of how I'm actually developing my applications that make containers really make sense. Right? So if I'm not doing that, then containers might actually be a negative because my operators don't know how to work with these things now. Right? So that to me is a way of differentiating the two.
Amen to what both of y'all said. It's true.
Speaking of the, we won't drill down on security too much because we just did that for almost an hour. And I know these guys are all securityed out, but just for this audience, whose responsibility is the security? Is that like the platform guys, the app guys? Like where do you secure this? Because this is, I know it's a little bit of a loaded question.
But yes.
But
all of the above.
It's a question we didn't cover on the earlier session. So yeah, go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, I think security does have to permeate throughout the entire organization, right? And that's one of the big problems we have with cloud is that security is always the other person's problem, right? Instead of my problem. So they tend not to think about it. I think there's a ton of things we can do with the technology to help as well. We are big proponents of immutable infrastructure. We're big proponents of over-the-air updates. In our opinion, one of the biggest issues with security is simply people who take care of their servers but don't patch them. Or they take forever to patch them because patching can be a pain, right? So one of the things that we're really driving and pushing is be able to do over-the-air updates where we can automatically push updates. Just like updates get pushed to our phone, we can push those updates to the servers that are running our Kubernetes clusters. So that was one of the big things that we have in Red Hat Core OS that you'll be able to take advantage of, container Linux. So there's a ton of stuff in there to push those updates. But the idea is to automate that, right? That's in these operators that we're talking about again. One of the things they can do is they can automate the update so you're not afraid to update, stay patched. That's one big way to battle the security problem, in my opinion.
And I will just reiterate what Maya from Google said on the last panel. She's like, everybody please run the latest version of Kubernetes because then you get the latest patches and you get all the good stuff. So just do that, make everybody.
Well, and I think, again, this shows a difference in thinking. So if you have Kubernetes, you're running an environment where basically everything except for maybe a couple processes are already containers. Right? All the control plane is containerized already. So it's very easy to say, yeah, I just restart a container because it's a couple of seconds, especially if I preload the image. It's really practically instantaneous to restart that process. Right? It's a kernel fork. Done. We're up and running. Everything's happy. That's different than saying, oh, I need to restart one of my control plane functions. Yes, it's control plane, so it's out of band, which means that I can restart it, but it's going to take 30 to 80 seconds for the VM to reboot to release some kernel memory so that I can sort of restart the processes. There really are differences there. So the more that we can start managing our infrastructure as containers, and I don't know if the folks out there that are running OpenStack have if you haven't already containerized your OpenStack, you really owe it to yourself to move to that process. Whether you do Kubernetes and then OpenStack on top, or just OpenStack in containers, it is really the only way to think about this because now you have this distributed application environment, and some people will say it's not perfect, but it doesn't really matter because you get massive benefits from running a distributed application in containers because of that ability to restart a process without impacting necessarily all of the other processes around it. So it really does change how you think about operating your environment when you can containerize those pieces.
And one thing I'd add is that it's a cultural shift too, right? Because the reason you're moving to containers is you want to gain this level of agility. And I'll kind of give you an anecdote here. When I'm a developer, and when there's no way to guarantee your code doesn't have bugs, right? And so what do we practice? We practice defensive coding. So we assume things are going to fail. We assume things are going to crash. And the whole point is, how do you live with it? How do you live with these failures? And the reason I say this is, unlike a lockdown machine-centric, hardware-centric, VM-centric, siloed environment where you can qualify a database for 6 months and deploy it and never touch it for a couple of years, that's not what you're doing with containers. By definition, you're pushing new bleeding-edge code all the time. So you're going to have problems. The point here is, if you put barriers to it, you're going back to the other old way of running things, and maybe you should just stick to that if that's your problem. But if you're going to lead with the bleeding edge, assume things are going to fail, build defensive practices around it. And so it's not just, you can't just look to a tool to solve this problem for you. You have to build enough internal methodologies and how you're going to manage this more agile infrastructure. So it's part software, part technology, but also part defensive mechanisms, if that makes sense.
So hey, wait, are there any Twitter questions? Are you guys asking any questions? No, not yet. Okay, shy audience. Remember, tweet at me if you want a question up. So let's talk about some OpenStack stuff, because there was a recent kind of recent OpenStack survey that said something like 45% of OpenStack users are also integrating Kubernetes, and there's other surveys have shown similar numbers. So before we get into some of the use cases, let's talk maybe about some of the projects that are making this possible. So is it Courier? Is it Kala? Is it Magnum? Do you need those? Or are people just going OpenStack Kubernetes in another way? And I'll direct this towards the OpenStack side of the room over there.
Yeah, so I mean, what I've seen is that depending on what the business need is, if your system is small, you're probably going to be looking at just containers. And there's the OpenStack Ansible project and the Kala project that are two ways of just using containers to get an OpenStack environment up and running. And I think those are very powerful, very functional tools for that. The thing that you don't usually get with that, because of the Ansible sort of run once and now it's sort of gotten my configuration done process, you don't usually get any life cycle management. It's not that you can't do upgrades and you can't keep things running, but you lose some of the benefits of what Kubernetes tries to bring to the fold. And yet at the same time, I think Kubernetes does add another layer of operations into your infrastructure. So if you're not big enough to want to have to deal with OpenStack and Kubernetes, I would follow one of those sort of baseline build onto VMs kind of approaches. That gives you the first layer. Now, adding Kubernetes on top of OpenStack, I think that's to me it's an obvious approach. Whether you're running on Kubernetes underneath or not, here now you get the ability to give your developers access to Kubernetes targets, and you can either do one for the entire company, or because you have multiple VMs and you have control planes and tools like Magnum to sort of deploy Kubernetes on top, using heat templates, using sort of many of the engines and components of OpenStack that have been built for many years, you can now deploy those resources, and now you have Kubernetes available for your end users. The Courier piece comes in if you want to make sure that your network is integrated so that VMs and containers can sort of experience the same network environment. That may or may not be your need, but that's another service that you can implement on top of Neutron to integrate the two network spaces as well. Right.
So I think it's important to say that I've been an OpenStacker for many years, and I love the OpenStack community tremendously. But I am so confused by all the different projects we have around Kubernetes and the different things we're doing for Kubernetes, when Kubernetes is pretty doggone good at what it does. So I'm really trying to figure it out. Like, there's like new projects all the time. Some like one's doing this angle, one's doing that angle. And some of the stuff Kubernetes already does, so I'm probably not the best person to ask on this question. I think we can do a lot to just kind of simplify what's going on, bring these groups together. I'm all for competition and figuring out the best project wins, but I think that can get a little out of control too. So all the stuff that's going around what we're doing in the OpenStack community in order to address Kubernetes, I think we really need to step back, take a look. Let's do what's essential. Let Kubernetes do what it does great. Let OpenStack do what it does great, and let's kind of just play together that way. My 2 cents.
I think we're seeing that at this conference more than ever coming together. In fact, I happen to know there's at least one person in this room that has been a core contributor to Magnum who is now contributing to Kubernetes as well. Yay! And I'm sure others of you probably fit that description. I won't embarrass her because she's shy. But anyway, and awesome, I'll add. So I think that we are seeing these communities coming together and working together. And like I said, I run an OpenStack meetup, but I've run 18 meetups on Kubernetes, and I'm not the only user group that's doing that. And this has been a great conference for really seeing people coming together around business problems and use cases as opposed to just the technology little sectors that we used to be in. Okay, does anyone, you don't have to be on Twitter to ask a question. We have mics on each side. Can you go to one of the mics, because I believe it's being recorded and will go out to billions of people, so no pressure.
Hi, my name is Omar. I just have a quick question. The deployment of a Kubernetes, are you looking more on a physical infrastructure, or it is more into a virtualized infrastructure where the consumption of this Kubernetes is happening in the market?
So I think, so first, I represent Portworx. We have now getting close to 100 customers in production or getting close to production, and I can give you our view of the world, which is it's all over the map. People don't typically, how they want to manage their hardware data center. That's usually a separate topic. The people that are embracing and deploying Kubernetes or this container-based PaaS, they're not hardware traditional IT admins, right? So they are given compute resources beforehand by somebody else managing their data center. A lot of times it's on OpenStack, it's on VMware. I would say a lot of it is in a virtualized environment, and a good, for us, 60% plus is in public cloud, which is all virtualized. It's been a fewer percentage of those guys that are actually where their hardware data center teams and their software teams are so aligned that they will just go bare metal and deploy bare metal. That's been, I think, less. The norm is virtualized.
So go ahead.
So as slowly, if we start going into the more enterprise applications, right? What do you see? Still, we'll keep on virtualizing it, or eventually do you see some interest going into the physical as well? I was a Solaris admin before, Solaris architect. I did a lot of zones, Solaris zones work, which is on M9000 and all that, right?
I'll let others speak here. My 2 cents are, again, it goes back to what I was saying before, how you want to manage your hardware resources. That's not really, I don't think it should be tied to how you want to manage your application deployment rollout, right? The people that are thinking about Kubernetes and containers, these are the guys that own their application infrastructure, and they want to run anywhere, whether it's virtualized or hardware. I don't think that's their primary concern. It's if you have a preference on how you want to manage your hardware resources and are trying to get that like last mile of bare metal performance, then you can go bare metal. That works just fine with Kubernetes because your applications are isolated inside of a container. But I don't think that that's a primary focus for how, from my vantage point, customers are approaching the problem.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say is that in most enterprises today, if you go to IT and say, hey, I need 16 machines to do something, right? I'm not even going to tell you what I'm going to do. I just need 16 machines for something. You're going to get 16 VMs, right? Because otherwise, you get to go through the, let's see, we need to procure those machines. It's going to take 3 months. We got to install them, the classic, we go right back to old school models. Most companies do not have, it's not that there aren't tools out there. I mean, look at what's going on with like the Ironic project, looking at bare metal as a manageable resource. Because there are use cases, especially when you start getting into machine learning, you want to have direct GPU access. You can do that. You can pass that through a VM directly to a container if you want to. It certainly is possible, but it adds layers of complexity and it adds some impact on performance. Right? So if you want the best performance and that's the direction you're going, your IT teams are probably starting to look at how can I manage metal as a service much like I do VMs. And I'm going to give you that when that's what you need. At the same time, if I'm building a Kubernetes application, you said enterprise apps, right? What is an enterprise app, right? Well, that usually implies old school, oh, well, I need a database that's redundantly connected to all my applications and I need redundant storage. It's like you've sort of defined something that isn't really what people are building in terms of next-gen apps. Right? They're looking at taking all of this distributed application technology, much of which has already been tested to a certain extent within even the OpenStack community in terms of how do you build a super scalable distributed app. Right? We're taking a lot of that knowledge and knowledge that's now being applied to applications that are deployed as microservice. Things like now service mesh technologies like Istio and Linkerd on top of these layers to tie our components together. I don't care about one component failure because my application has been written to not care. Right? When I get there, I don't care if you do it on VMs or bare metal. I just know that I want this API, Kubernetes is the API, to launch and manage my operations for my app. And it's a different approach.
And just one last question, definitely I will leave the mic after that. The management of the Kubernetes means I go and talk a lot about to my customers and talk to them. They usually ask question that who should manage the Docker implementation or container implementation and who should manage the infrastructure. So is it a mixed teamwork with the applications and the infrastructure team work together, make a new DevOps team, or it is still siloed? Application teams or developers are doing the development of images or containers and the infrastructure team is doing the deployment.
Yeah, a lot of the customers that we work with, I'm actually seeing infrastructure teams that are taking care of the infra. I mean, we're all long-lived DevOps, so I mean, like, I'm down for that and everything. But I think practically when I go out into the field, I see a lot of infrastructure teams doing their thing, and then there's dev teams doing their thing. They talk to each other, right? But I do see it's not a kumbaya quite yet. There's still a silo there, in my opinion.
The way I'm seeing enterprises now agile enterprises getting organized are the following way, right? What it used to be is there traditionally used to be a storage IT team,
Yes.
a networking team, a machine. I think that's going away. What's happening now from, again, in this ecosystem is that there's a new platform team that we're seeing being formed. These guys are tasked with providing the next generation PaaS, right? Platform as a service that can inherently host containers regardless of the infrastructure that the end user is going to run on. So there's two teams in this case, right? There's your cloud native platform team who are the cloud architects. They get to choose what infrastructure they're going to run on, be it bare metal, VMs, public cloud. They're going to make that choice based on a number of reasons: cost, manageability, what's easy for them from a security perspective. Maybe they have regulatory and compliance restrictions. So they're going to choose where they run. But at the end of the day, they provide an abstraction layer to their business, to their customers, who are the application owners, who really don't give a damn where things are running. They have a programmatic interface. They're just going to use Kubernetes. Operators say, go deploy my application. Maybe it's running in Amazon today. Maybe it's going to run in Google tomorrow. This notion of cross-cloud, multi-cloud, that flexibility, that's what we're talking about in this new ecosystem. So hopefully that answers your question, which is it's not... people don't think about this from infrastructure perspective, physical infrastructure. They think about it from what do I need to get my business to go from point A to point B faster.
Yeah, and if I don't have to manage an operating system as an application developer, I won't.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so unless anyone has a super, super quick question, I'm going to ask these guys for closing thoughts, and you can see how long you have, and you can share that between you. So no super quick questions. Okay, so what I always ask our customers if I'm writing up a case study is, lessons learned. You've been in this, you're the experts. If you could just kind of give like one piece of advice to everybody out there, what would it be?
I'll start. My one piece of advice is it's not just about the technology, it's also about the business process. If the business process and technology align, and if we can find that alignment, you'll have a successful deployment into whatever technology space you choose.
My one-word advice is think about day two operations. Once you get it installed, that's great. Let's think about day two operations. GitHub.com/operator-framework.
I honestly second the day two operations aspect, especially when state is involved. But my advice would be choose the right tool for the right purpose. If you're going to run a long-running application, very few changes, agility is really not that important. Stay with the status quo. I mean, VMs, bare metal, they work fine. Where containers really matter, I guess, is where you have business applications that agility is of importance. I think if you're going to start thinking cloud native, cloud centric, not being tied to a physical infrastructure environment, that's where I think tools like Kubernetes and the rest of that ecosystem in the cloud native compute foundation really will start to resonate with you. It'll make your life a lot easier.
And that's one thing that I'll say too. It is an ecosystem, as Gu just mentioned. It's a cloud native ecosystem, and I titled this thing Kubernetes, but it was a little bit of a generic word for containers. It's just that one gets your attention a little bit better than some of the other words we could have put up there. But we love our friends at Mesosphere, and we love our friends at Docker, and we work with all those technologies, those of us in the container space. So there's a lot of awesome players, and so there's a lot of great technologies to embrace, and there's a lot of really cool upstream projects to contribute to. So we don't all have to just jump in and write code for Kubernetes. There is so many awesome open source projects that I would love to see you guys all get involved, and amazing communities that I'd love to see you all get involved in, including our San Francisco Bay Area community. So I hope I see all of you at a meetup coming soon to you or online. And I guess with that, we'll wrap. I want to thank these guys so much. It's been so fun. Again, I love these guys. It's been so fun. So thank you. Everybody give them a big hand. All right, thanks, y'all, and keep the conversation going. These are our Twitter handles. This doesn't have to end now. If you have a question, just ping us. Almost all of us, Tony might be the exception, check our Twitter feeds quite often. So tweet at us. I'm calling you out, boy. Tweet at us, and yeah, that's us. Thanks.